Sittings. Welcome to our third session of oral evidence on this bill. All of our witnesses today will be giving evidence by video link. Before calling the first panel of witnesses, I should first like to remind all members that questions should be limited to matters within the scope of the bill and that we must stick to the timings in the programme motion the committee has agreed. For this first panel, we have until 10 minutes past 10. I now call the first panel of witnesses, Professor William Webb, CEO of Webb Search, and Emily Taylor, Chief Executive, Oxford Information Labs. Would our witnesses please be kind enough to introduce yourselves for the record and make a brief opening statement? And we'll start with ladies first. Emily Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. My name is Emily Taylor. I'm a lawyer by training. I've worked in the internet environment for more than 20 years. I'm CEO of Oxford Information Labs, a cyber intelligence consultancy. We are actively involved in standards organisations such as the ITU. I have co-authored papers on 5G and geopolitics and on China's efforts to standardise a new internet. I'm an Associate Fellow at Chatham House, editor of the Journal of Cyber Policy, and a research associate at Oxford Internet Institute. I've listened to the evidence that you've heard so far, and there are three areas where I think I can bring new information or offer alternative perspectives to the committee. These are why standards matter and what China is doing in standards, the need for a holistic approach to minimising cybersecurity risks across critical national infrastructure and especially supply chains, and the China containment strategy and whether there might be more positive alternatives. I have several drafting points on the bill itself, which I'm happy to explore with you if time allows. And of course, I'm happy to answer any other questions you would like to put to me within my capabilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor William Webb.
Thank you, Chair. My name is William Webb. I'm an engineer by background. I've worked as a telecoms consultant for many years, which is what I do now, advising regulators, operators and manufacturers around the globe. Of relevance, perhaps to this committee, is that I spent 7 years at Ofcom, helping them with radio spectrum and technology strategy. I spent 18 months with DCMS, helping them with their 5G program. And I have in the past co-founded a startup in the telecom space, so I understand that area. I think I can potentially help the committee on the security side by looking at whether we can be sure that we're being proportionate with our response to security issues. And I can certainly help on the diversification side by talking a little about the strategies of operators, the potential role of ORAN and other such diversification strategies, and perhaps some of the better ways to deliver diversification in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm now in members' hands. Who would like to be first out of the blocks? Kevin Jones.
Thank you very much for agreeing to come before us this morning. Emily, could you just expand on your issues around standards and how important this is going to be in terms of how telecom sector develops in the future? And who are the leading players in terms of setting those standards? Clearly, you've made reference to China in terms of trying to get a set of regulations which suit them. Where are we at in terms of what's been described in many documents as the D10 of trying to get democratic nations to influence this agenda, and what do you see the way forward?
Thank you very much for those questions. First aspect, why standards are important. Standards can be very long and drawn out, not the most interesting thing to participate in, but they are vital, both for our security going forward and as part of the diversification strategy. So dominance or over-reliance on a small number of players is bad for innovation, for security, and also for procurement. And it's great to see the importance of standards coming through in the diversification strategy that's published. although standards can take many years to be created, they also hang around for many years. And so if you miss the boat with a particular standard when it's critical to a new industry or technology, then that can have a lasting effect on your domestic and international industries. Now, many scholars, such as Laura Donardis, have pointed out that technology is not neutral, and this really applies in standards. By accident or design, standards embed the attitudes, values, and worldview of the engineers who create them. And that's not been really a problem for Western countries to date, because the US and European participants have tended to dominate. But now going forward, what we need to do is find a new way of coping and coexisting with a technological superpower that doesn't share our values and which has been investing heavily with a strategic approach to standards for several years. You asked who are the leading players in standards, and what I'd like to and particularly you alluded to the role of China. I think it's quite telling to just reflect on the number of leadership positions currently held by Chinese nationals across the standards organization's environment. And of course, there are many standards organizations. You've got the Internet Engineering Task Force, you have the ITU, which sits within the UN, then you have other bodies such as 3GPP, ETSI, and so on. The Chinese players that we see, not just from the government, but industry, include Huawei, FutureWay, ZTE, China Mobile, CAT, and Tencent. All of them are active in standards. The ITU is headed by a Chinese national, and of 11 working groups within ITUT, China has a chair or vice chair in 10 of those working groups, and a total of 25 positions at chair or vice chair, 135 so-called questions, which are sort of agenda items across those working groups, and 87 rapporteurs. I could go on, but I think the point is made. Where are we with D10? As you'll know, the Defence Committee quite majored on the idea of a D10, and it's been an idea that's been going around for several years. I think that the key element of it, as I understand it, is a recognition that this country needs to act with others in order to have a chance of having the coverage and investment that China has shown. And also that there are like-minded countries that we can partner with across standards, and also to really reinvest in domestic or shared capability for manufacturing. Manufacturing has been leaving Western countries for more than 30 years. And I think we're now seeing the effect of that. It's all very well to worry about the rise of China, but if you are at the same time asking China to make absolutely everything, then it's inevitable that there will be some technology transfer. The D10 doesn't, of course, exist. The idea of a Five Eyes type of thing that would also morph into an economic and legal type of partnership, that also doesn't exist. It's an intelligence sharing network. It's not an economic bloc, and it's not a trading bloc. So there are challenges, but there are also opportunities for partnerships. Thank you.
Can I ask, just in terms of the response you've said, it's quite clear that China have been active in this sector, and it's not unusual if you look at other international bodies where they've also done the similar types of thing. So have we in the West taken our eye off the ball in terms of representation on these bodies? And what will it take to step up to the plate in terms of being involved in these standard settings?
Well, I think it's a bit like kind of waking up halfway through a chess game and realizing you're about 3 moves away from checkmate. I think we have taken the eye off the ball, although I must say the UK has been strong on standards and has invested in standards. But we can't match that. What we're seeing is the fruits of a long-term patient strategy is all laid out in the China Standards 2035 document. But also, I think that what some people in working groups, they're saying, you know, they get something like more than 100 papers to deal with just before a meeting. There is a sense that we are really losing grip. And I think part of that is because we didn't really realise how far standards embed our values until we start to see the alternatives. New IP is something that we've been writing about and studying over the last year, and that's China's efforts to standardise effectively an alternative architecture for the internet, which would not be compatible with what we have today. And that is at quite an advanced state across numerous working groups within the ITU. Thank you.
Professor Webb, would you like to respond?
Thank you. Yes, so I certainly agree with all of that. I have actually written standards myself. I've even run a standards body, so I know how they work. And I think the problem is that it's not possible for a government just to say, we're going to influence that standard. Standards are influenced by the working papers written by the companies that attend the standards body. So the UK government itself could not really have an influence, and nor could a university or any other organisation like that, not unless you spent an inordinate amount of money and hired a lot of people to write a lot of papers. So really it needs to be a concerted global or Western European or some kind of larger scale activity that can help the larger companies with the resources and the expertise in these standards bodies step up their efforts on that basis.
Sarah Beckliffe.
Good morning, William. You alluded to this in your introduction, and just what do you think the main risks to the what are the main risks to the bill achieving the government's aims for the security of the telecoms network? And then if you can expand on how you believe these could be mitigated as well, please.
Professor Webb.
Was that to me, sorry?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think the bill is actually fine in terms of delivering potentially the security desires. It seems to be a very flexible bill. It seems to have the capability to do all those kind of things. I think my key worry is actually more one of proportionality. So that the bill essentially says everything must be done to make sure that these networks are completely secure. And of course, security is extremely important. But we could have a situation where there's a very, very tiny risk of some security breach, but the mitigation is inordinately expensive. And that might result in higher consumer costs for mobile phones. And Ofcom, I think, will need to weigh up that proportionality and make sure that its response is correctly balanced. But I don't really see that in the bill. And I worry that the risk aversion that I think will happen automatically with a regulator will result in perhaps excessive security measures that might penalise consumers when they're not particularly necessary. So I think that's my biggest concern looking at the current structure.
Emily Taylor.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with William's overview on the bill. It's great to see that the industry welcomes it. We heard from Kieran Martin yesterday in his evidence to the National Security Strategy Committee that industry asked for this in a way, and because it had got to the limit of what it could do on a voluntary basis. And so it will lead to substantial investments in security. That's great. The TSRs are almost a recipe book, very, very clear a set of instructions on how to build more secure networks. That's great, and particularly their focus on, securing the management plane. But as William has described, there's almost that in certain scenarios there are almost unlimited liability for providers, not just to their customers, but to every person who could be affected by a contravention under Section 8. The inspection notices give very wide powers, including entry to premises, and the provider pays for that. And so there's not going to be much incentive for Ofcom as the regulator to think about, well, is this justified value for money wise, and how to target interventions. I could go on, but I think that the other question that I have is about Ofcom's capacity in this sector, because there's going to have to be very specific set of skills and capabilities that it will have to acquire, and that will require substantial investment and learning as an organisation as well. Thank you.
Can I just quickly follow up to both witnesses? Were you consulted on the bill prior to this?
Professor Webb, were you consulted on the bill prior to this?
No, I was not.
Emily Taylor?
No.
Shiomura.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to serve under you again. And thank you very much to the witnesses for joining us this morning. And obviously, should declare that William and I worked at side-by-side desks in Ofcom for a number of years. So I'm well aware of your expertise in this area. And I have a couple of questions, one to each. And just to start with you, William, and we've heard from Mavenir on Thursday that, in their view, Open RAN could provide They said it could provide now 2, 3, 4, and 5G networks, but that the operators weren't looking to purchase the networks from them. Now, as you said in your opening statement, what is your view on the maturity of, the accuracy of that statement, the maturity of Open RAN, and what challenges does that pose in regard to the diversification strategy as set out by the Diversification Task Force?
Thank you, Chi. So, I'm sure Mavenir are correct that they can sell equipment that can do 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G. But that isn't sufficient for an existing operator. So if they want to put this equipment into their network, it needs to work with their network diagnostic systems. It needs to handle all of the various features that they might have been delivering either to customers, businesses, or whatever, or that they might use for optimizing their network, all the various software systems that they have. And they built these up over 20, 30 years in some cases. So actually adding in new equipment is a lot more than simply ticking the box and saying it can transmit 2G, it can transmit 3G. And so that takes quite some time, particularly with the more complex base stations that we find in city centres. The ones that are in rural areas typically are much simpler. They're less problematic if they go wrong. And that's why we see people like Vodafone trialling Open RAN in those places. So I think whilst Mavenir are, in a way, they have all the ticks in the boxes, they don't yet have worked through with the operators to deliver something that really works well with their network. And as we've heard from the operators, that's a long, slow process. The operators quite rightly are risk averse. What they don't want to do is rush out a whole load of equipment and for their networks to fail after a few months with all the problems that that would have for consumers. So it does seem to me that we are still quite some time away. I think the operators have said 5, 6, maybe 7 years from any significant deployment of Open RAN. I think that sounds very plausible to me as a strategy for evolving their network. And of course, by the time we get to that point, they will have deployed most of their 5G network already. So it does feel like Open RAN will be a bit too little too late to have a significant impact on diversifying the 5G networks that we have in the country and that we will have for the next few years.
So what would your recommendations be in terms of an effective diversification strategy then? And where is UK capability strong?
Yeah, so my thinking would be, if I wanted to diversify, I would instruct the telecom operators to diversify. I wouldn't try and pull the levers one step removed. So I would say to the telecoms operators, either with a carrot or a stick, you must diversify. So the carrot may be, if you have X number of vendors in your network, then I will give you X million pounds as a carrot. The stick might be some kind of license condition that said, in order to meet your license, you have to have at least X number of vendors in your network. That would seem to me to be the way to pull through. And then the operators can decide whether they want ORAN, whether they want someone like NEC or Samsung or someone like that. They can make that choice, and that will pull through the decisions to them, rather than the government trying to decide on their behalf what the best technology for them to use might be.
Can I ask a question to Emily? What other security threats do you other security threats which are not addressed or not fully addressed by the bill as it stands? How can we ensure that our networks are resilient to future security threats? And for example, I'm thinking of the consolidation in cloud services, for example, and as we move to a more software-based networks, more and more of the value is in the cloud services. And just one example, say for example, Amazon Web Services was bought by a Chinese company. Would you consider that a threat to us, the security of our networks?
Thank you very much for those questions. As a general point about the cybersecurity of critical national infrastructure, I feel a little like we've been fetishizing 5G and a single company for the last 2 years, perhaps at the expense of a more holistic awareness of systemic cybersecurity risks. Kieran Martin spoke eloquently yesterday about the need for a flexibility in what is critical national infrastructure. The last year has shown us that what is critical very much depends on what you're going through at the time. Healthcare systems probably wouldn't have been top of the list 2 years ago, but now they are. The SolarWinds attack shows that the identity of the vendor is not always the key risk point. SolarWinds, a very trusted vendor from a like-minded, close ally country, and yet it turns out to be a critical single point of failure across key, very sensitive government departments, both in the US and UK. Thank you for talking about the consolidation across cloud services, Chi, because one of my reflections on Open RAN, of course, I'm excited at the idea of open interoperable standards, which would prevent vendor lock-in. But most of my experience has been spent in the internet environment rather than the mobile environment. And we are replete with open interoperable standards, and we have a major competition problem. And so that in itself is not going to be enough of a lever to secure diversification. But the point about acquisitions, particularly where you've got cutting edge technologies coming through. This country is really good at R&D. We've got wonderful universities full of very brainy people who are creating things. But there doesn't seem to be the follow through then to create world-beating companies that can compete across the world stage. And why is that? Is because they either get sold to US or to China. Now, of course, the foreign investment security strategies are all part of this as well. But you make a key point. If Amazon Web Services was sold to a frenemy country, that would potentially introduce the same kind of, at least theoretical security risks that we've been troubled by over Huawei and 5G. And it's also the case that consolidation of infrastructure providers like the cloud providers is also a security risk because they become too big to fail. We've seen, there was a brief outage of Google just before Christmas, I think, and people just can't work. There was also when Cloudflare goes down, or if Dyn goes down, then those introduce massive outages, particularly at a point where we're all so reliant on technology to do our work. These are security risks, and it highlights the need for a flexible approach. You have to be looking across all sectors.
Thank you. I see that William wants to come in. I just wanted to also say that we've also been told that there was a major difference between hardware and between fixed and mobile architecture when it came to security issues. But you seem to be saying, well, there may be differences, but there are security issues within our fixed networks as well as within our mobile networks.
Generally, our standard of security across the board is not as high as it should be.
Professor Webb.
Thank you. I realised that she had asked me also how can the UK strengthen its ability to provide diversified supply chains, and I didn't address that. And I wanted to pick up on something Emily said as well. I think she's absolutely right. The UK has a great number of really excellent engineers, both in universities and in leading consultancy type organisations. And where I live here in Cambridge, there's a plethora of wonderful consultancies and startup companies. In my experience, the biggest problem is actually finance. To try and raise the finance to get a startup company off the ground, particularly one that sells to operators who have huge purchasing power and tend to squeeze all of their vendors quite naturally, is very, very difficult in the UK, much easier in the US. So addressing the ability to provide finance for those kind of entities, and to Emily's point, allowing them to exist for many years rather than to be bought as part of that financial process, would, I think, help more than anything else for the UK to grow its own major players in this space.
Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you, and thank you for your comments so far. I think you will have seen in the diversification strategy that we completely agree with the points that you've made around standards and around the importance of international cooperation. So I won't go further into that. But what I think is interesting is a lot of what you've talked about is the diversification strategy rather than the bill itself. And I wonder where we have put increased duties on Ofcom, for instance, where do you feel that there should be more in legislation rather than in the diversification strategy itself? Because it seems to me that tying our hands is not what you're asking us to do, but there obviously is a balance there, isn't there?
Professor Webb?
Yes, I think there's a balance there. I don't have any strong views on that. I think the legislation appears to me to be sufficient and flexible in the space. I think it's the way that it's implemented, and particularly sort of the downstream actions of the government and of Ofcom that might need a bit more care.
Emily Taylor.
The legislation is creating a framework, and a lot of it will be filled out through statutory instrument and the codes of practice that are envisioned. And I imagine that the codes of practice will probably reflect the TSRs to a large degree. I think if thinking about the impact, particularly how this legislation might impact on the wish and the essential need to diversify, it imposes very, very high levels of liability for providers, also almost unlimited duties to everybody for the smallest infractions, and this is William Webb's point about proportionality. And so as it sort of comes to life through the secondary legislation and the codes of practice and the actions of Ofcom, it's going to be very important that there are checks and balances. One of the concerns, I'm not sure whether this committee is hearing from many civil society groups, but I'm sure that they would be worried about the almost, the very wide discretion for the Secretary of State. There's a lot of concentration of power in the Secretary of State, and perhaps, in my opinion, insufficient safeguards as currently drafted. And also the provisions that relate to the identity of the supplier, the nationality, rather than the qualities of security, which I think are the more relevant points. Of course, identity and nationality can be relevant, but I think that there may need to be more of a look there to ensure that we're on the right side of, potential risks of discrimination. Thank you.
I think it's worth saying in response to that there isn't, there's never going to be such a one-dimensional approach as the one that you've described. I don't think that you're suggesting that there is, but I think we agree that there is a balance to be struck, and inevitably that comes in a whole series of advice from agencies and others. I was interested in something that Professor Webb said there about the carrot and the stick. How would you propose that governments, or I suspect actually Ofcom, incentivise operators to provide the greater security that you've been talking about?
Emily Taylor.
I think that was a question to Professor Webb.
Well, but both of you, to be fair, but I did say Professor Webb.
You'll both get a chance. We'll go to Professor Webb.
So yes, I'm certainly all in favour of placing the requirements on those best placed to deliver it, which for diversifications is certainly the operators. And I talked a bit there about how you could, for example, offer them some financial incentive in order to have a more diversified supplier base, which would make some kind of sense given that it would add more costs to their management of the network. In terms of security, I think that one's a bit more difficult to see how that one might follow. I can imagine there might be certain security issues where, for example, the decision might be made that a replacement is needed of a certain component in the network, or that they need to purchase some additional element. And then you might imagine that there might need to be, or might help to be, some sort of financial incentive for them to do that. But I think that would be more on a case-by-case basis. I can't see a clear catch-all kind of approach that would enable that.
Emily Taylor?
Yes, I very much agree with what Professor Webb has said. And it is one of my reflections on the draft bill is that it's very much at the stick end rather than the carrot end. Maybe we'll start to see a bit more of the incentives coming through as the detail is filled out. But I think that thinking about incentives, and it would very much reflect the close working relationship that there has historically been between the industry and government, and that is, not the case in every country. It's actually a benefit in this case. But security is expensive. It's also long term. And the market, the telecom supply chain review last year put it very accurately. The market does not reward investment in security, quite the opposite. And so I would hope that there would be some recognition from government about what is needed. It's really going to, I don't think that the investment in the diversification strategy is nearly going to match the investment that is required by the mobile providers who, yes, they're very successful large companies, but they've not had the great decade that, say, the Googles of the world have had in terms of their margins. And so you're asking an already squeezed sector to make substantial investments. And I think that is the place where you could be looking at incentives.
Christian Matheson.
And actually, Mr. Taylor almost answered the question, but I just want to press both witnesses on this because the Minister talked about, referred to Professor Webb's comment on carrot and stick. And obviously, we are very keen to see diversification of suppliers and an increase in domestic capability as far as possible. There's one way of looking at this legislation, which is that it can provide a market-led opening for suppliers who perhaps, in a market that is no longer in the long term going to be distorted by, for example, Huawei with its state backing. Is there any evidence, therefore, that other suppliers, and first tier and lower down suppliers, are looking at this and thinking, there's a chance here to get back into the game? Mr. Taylor, you talked about security being quite a difficult, quite an expensive barrier to overcome. But I just wondered whether there is any discussions within the wider sector that there's an opportunity to be had here, or whether actually a stronger diversification strategy is necessary.
Thank you very much. The initiative is welcome. The diversification strategy is welcome. But as Professor Webb has described, there are many barriers to entry for new suppliers. To build out an entire country's network requires substantial scale, and very understandably, the operators are risk averse. And so you can't just turn up and build out a network. Open RAN is exciting, but as you've heard from witnesses and this morning from Professor Webb, it's not ready yet to build out an entire country. And also the market distortions can still happen despite a diversification strategy. You can well imagine that the companies that decide it's attractive to enter this market are not perhaps the cheeky startups that you would want to encourage. They would be already dominant in other sectors. Imagine if we're sitting here in 5 or 10 years' time lamenting the fact that the equipment market is now dominated by Microsoft and Google. I'm just making that up as an example, a hypothetical example. I have no knowledge to back that up. But those are the companies who have the sufficient scale and skills. And as Chionwara said in her question, we're moving to a more hybrid network where skills in cloud computing and software are going to be defining about the success of a player. Thank you.
Webb?
Yeah, so a point from me, I think if you want to encourage a new entrant, be that a company that has some skills in this space but is upping its game to develop a complete system, or a brand new company, then they've got to develop the equipment, and that involves developing a lot of software, a lot of hardware, an awful lot of effort in investment. If you add yet more requirements on them, for example, security requirements, that makes their effort even harder to do. So it makes it even harder for a new entrant to compete with the existing players who have already made much of that investment and have the scale and the capability to add on that extra. So actually, I think adding security on, which is the right thing to do, I'm not criticizing that, but I think the implication of it will be it actually makes it harder to diversify the supply chain. What you actually want to do is try and make it as easy as possible for new entrants with the minimum requirements on equipment if you want to bring a larger number in.
But it would level the playing field. It would level the playing field, would it not? So that everybody's having to work to the same level of security standards rather than others thinking that they can jump in there and cut in.
I'm not sure that it would quite work like that. I think the operators would always want to procure to a certain security standard, whether there be legislation or not. So everyone would have to get to that standard. By raising the standards bar, essentially you require everyone to then move up higher on that bar.
And if I may, just to support Professor Webb's point, the security standards, they don't level the playing field, although they're the right thing to do, in just the same way as we've seen some of the perverse consequences of, say, GDPR. The companies that have the scale and capacity to sort of absorb the cost of compliance fare better than the smaller companies who really don't have the scale and capability. And so the disincentive to enter the market, or perhaps the incentive to exit the market as a result of these requirements, hits precisely the type of companies that you want to encourage. And so although it's welcome to see some recognition of that in the fact sheets with the tiering system, and that the third tier would probably let the smaller independent ISPs off the hook and providers off the hook, it is still, I think it's not quite correct to view it as these security requirements levelling the playing field. They are definitely required, and the market is not delivering that. But it will require close monitoring, I think, to ensure that there's still a competitive market.
If I've got it completely wrong, feel free to say, by the way, that I've got it completely wrong, because you're the expert here, not me. And so finally, Mr. Holloman, if I may, if you could sum up the chat around the sector at the moment. I get the impression that you're suggesting that there is still a way to go to bring confidence that we can diversify across the broad range of the sector as a result of this proposed legislation, that there's still some more reassurance and more consultation required.
Shall I pick that one up first? So certainly, as I look at the information that I get back on ORAN, I think that there is a lot more scepticism of its ability to do anything in the short term than there is optimism throughout the sector. And we talked a bit about why that's the case. I think there's more promise potentially from the vendors that are somewhat established, the Samsungs and the NECs, and there's generally better comment about their ability to do something. So if I had to look at what I'm seeing around the industry and bring some advice, I think it would be focused on those vendors rather than ORAN as the most likely source of diversification over the next few years.
Emily Taylor?
Yeah, the feedback that I've been getting, in a way, I come from a segment of the internet environment which has not historically been highly regulated at all, and I just reflect that if this bill was brought forward to cover that sector, you would be hearing the screams. And one of the things that has really surprised me and reassured me to a certain extent is that, and it came through in the evidence that you heard, is a sort of degree of comfort with the direction of travel. And I think that speaks to the strong relationship that the industry has with government on that. So, yeah, thank you.
We've got 5 minutes left. I'm afraid there's a hard stop at 10 minutes past 10. There are 2 members seeking to ask questions. So would our witnesses treat this as a quick fire round with punchy, pithy responses? Kevin Jones.
Can I just ask your thoughts in terms of Ofcom being the regulator for security. Has it got the capacity, or I would say culture, to ensure the security of the network, particularly in light, if you read the ISC's report on critical national infrastructure from 2013, where you had a situation there where civil servants didn't even tell ministers about security threats. Wouldn't it be better placing this in a agency which is responsible for security rather than a regulator which has a wide range of responsibilities?
Professor Webb?
Yeah, so I think it's already been alluded to that Ofcom, I doubt at the moment, has that capability. In principle, it could acquire it, it could hire the people that have that expertise. But it does feel to me that the need for secrecy in many of these areas is always going to mean that actually we're probably better off with one centre of excellence where the threats are analysed and assessed and understood. And we have that, of course, in NCSC. And it feels to me that they would then advise Ofcom perhaps at a higher level. Perhaps they wouldn't need to detail exactly what the issue was, but they could talk to them about the mitigation. And then Ofcom could be the entity that performs the proportionality of understanding whether it thinks that threat needs to be addressed and to what extent it needs to be addressed in the mix of all the other things. So that's how I would arrange the organisations.
Emily Taylor?
Yes, thank you for this question and going both to the capabilities and to the culture. I think that the capabilities, as I've said in earlier remarks, are going to need to, Ofcom's going to need to upskill, and in reality, as Professor Webb has said, they are going to be reliant on expert advice from NCSC, at least for the medium term, until there's a significant transfer of skills and technology, and also the need for secrecy and the need for that broader view. So also Ofcom's historical role has been much less interventionist than is foreseen in this piece of legislation. And those cultural changes go deep into the organisation and into the character of the people who work there. Cultural change is always difficult and takes time. And so I wouldn't underestimate the challenge.
Thank you. James Sunderland.
Mr. Chair, thank you. A very explicit question for the topic, perhaps, but could I ask both of you whether, from the security perspective, you agree with the decision to kick out high-risk vendors from the network? And if so, why?
30 seconds each, I'm afraid. Emily Taylor.
I think it was inevitable after the US sanctions on semiconductor chips. It's something I regret, because I think that the more difficult path is what we had been trying to do for 17 years, which is to treat all of the networks as potentially vulnerable and adopt an evidence-based approach. I don't think there's a going back from there, but I think, unfortunately, the effect of the US sanctions has not just been on our domestic market, but it will have hardened the resolve of China to have an entirely indigenous supply chain, and therefore will hasten exactly the outcomes that it is intended to avoid. We need a much more positive approach, investing in innovation, research, and matching the capability and advocating for the benefits of a single, open, and free internet.